Get out, soldier! The words cracked across the courtroom like a gavel strike of their own, echoing off the high wooden ceiling before anyone had even finished sitting down. Julian Marchetti stood at the podium, a thin manila folder trembling slightly in his hands. 3 years of paperwork condensed into 42 pages he had hoped, prayed, someone would finally read. Judge Desmond Ashworth hadn't opened the folder at all. It sat closed on the bench in front of him, untouched, while he glared down at the man standing below. "Your Honor," Julian said carefully, "I served 2 tours. I have documentation showing the foreclosure notice was mailed while I was deployed overseas, in direct violation of federal protections for—" "I've heard this story a dozen times this month alone," Ashworth snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "Every veteran who can't manage their finances suddenly discovers a federal protection clause. Case dismissed." "Your Honor, if you'd just review the—" "Get out, soldier!" Ashworth's voice thundered again, rising from his chair. "This court has no patience left for manufactured sympathy. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Marchetti out before I hold him in contempt." Julian stood frozen for a long moment, the folder still clutched in his hands, 42 unread pages that represented the only home he and his daughter had left. Behind him, in the gallery, a young law clerk named Elise Duval sat perfectly still, her pen frozen mid-note, staring at the judge with an expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet, mounting anger. She had seen this exact scene before, more than once, and she was about to do something about it. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. I read as many as I can. And if you enjoy powerful justice stories with unforgettable twists like this one, please take a moment to hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us bring you more stories exactly like this. Now, let's go back to where this all began. Because to understand why Judge Ashworth's 4 words mattered so much, and why they were about to unravel far more than one man's case, you need to understand exactly who Julian Marchetti was, and what he'd already survived long before he ever set foot in that courtroom. Julian Marchetti had learned, a long time ago, that surviving something didn't mean the fight was over. He had served 8 years in the Army, including 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, earning a Purple Heart after a roadside explosion outside Kandahar left shrapnel scars along his left forearm that still ached whenever the weather turned cold. He'd come home to Mill Haven, Ohio, quieter than he'd left, carrying memories he rarely spoke of, and a fierce, unwavering devotion to the one thing that had kept him grounded through every deployment. His daughter, Rosalie, now 11 years old, growing up faster than he liked to admit. Julian worked as a maintenance supervisor at the local community college, arriving early every morning to fix boilers and flickering hallway lights before students ever noticed anything had been wrong. He rarely mentioned his service unless directly asked, uncomfortable with the assumption that a uniform made him somehow more remarkable than the neighbors and co-workers who'd never worn one. His modest 3-bedroom house on Kestrel Lane had been purchased with a VA loan the year Rosalie was born, and it represented, more than any medal or commendation ever could, the one piece of stability he'd fought hardest to build for his daughter after her mother left them both when Rosalie was barely 2 years old. Every evening after work, Julian picked Rosalie up from her after-school program, and the 2 of them cooked dinner together in the small kitchen he'd renovated himself over a series of quiet weekends, teaching her along the way how to properly season a pan, or tell when rice had finished steaming. Saturdays were reserved for the backyard, where he'd promised her, for nearly a year now, that he would finally teach her to ride her bike without training wheels once the weather turned warm enough. His neighbors on Kestrel Lane knew him as reliable and unassuming, the kind of man who shoveled the elderly widow's driveway next door without being asked, who coached Rosalie's youth soccer team every fall, despite his own aching knees, who rarely complained about anything, even when complaining might have been entirely justified. Few of them knew the specifics of his combat record, and Julian preferred it that way, uncomfortable with the idea that his service defined him more than the quiet, steady life he'd worked so hard to build in its aftermath. 18 months earlier, Julian had been redeployed on short notice for a specialized 6-month assignment overseas, a deployment mandated so abruptly that his mortgage servicer, through a combination of bureaucratic error and simple negligence, had failed to properly process the legal protections guaranteed to him under federal law. By the time Julian returned home, a foreclosure notice was already waiting in his mailbox, the process further along than it legally should have ever been allowed to progress. He had spent the following year fighting through paperwork, phone calls, and increasingly desperate appeals to reverse a foreclosure that should never have been permitted to advance in the first place, finally scraping together enough support from a local veterans legal aid clinic to bring his case before a judge. He believed, walking into that courtroom, that the truth documented in his 42-page file would finally be enough. He had no idea he was about to be dismissed before a single page was ever turned. Judge Desmond Ashworth had presided over Millhaven's civil docket for 11 years, and in that time he had built a reputation for two things: efficiency and an almost theatrical impatience with anything he perceived as excuse-making. He moved through his daily caseload like a man racing a clock only he could see, rarely spending more than a few minutes on any single filing before rendering judgment. Attorneys who appeared before him learned quickly to keep their arguments brief, their evidence pre-summarized, and their expectations low. Ashworth had grown up the son of a decorated Navy officer, a man whose rigid discipline had shaped Ashworth's entire understanding of personal responsibility. His father had never once made an excuse for anything in his life, and Ashworth had absorbed that lesson so thoroughly that he'd come to view any claim of extenuating circumstance, medical, financial, or otherwise, as a kind of moral weakness he refused to indulge from the bench. Somewhere over the years, that philosophy had curdled into something closer to blanket suspicion. Ashworth had grown particularly dismissive of veterans' legal claims specifically, having presided over 2 prior cases years earlier that he'd later learned, uncomfortably, had been exaggerated by the claimants involved. Rather than treating those as isolated incidents, Ashworth had allowed them to harden into a permanent bias, one he rarely examined and never once questioned. His own son, Nathaniel, had enlisted against Ashworth's explicit wishes nearly a decade earlier, a decision that had strained their relationship for years afterward. Ashworth, despite his father's own military background, had wanted something different for his son. Law school, perhaps? Or medicine? A path he considered safer and more predictable than the uncertainty of combat deployment. When Nathaniel returned home injured after a harrowing incident overseas, Ashworth had never quite found the words to properly discuss what happened, retreating instead into a gruff, distant pride that masked feelings he rarely examined too closely. Father and son spoke perhaps once a month, brief and cordial conversations that rarely ventured beneath the surface of pleasantries. Ashworth told himself, when pressed, that his courtroom demeanor toward veterans had nothing to do with his own son's service. He genuinely believed his skepticism was simply the product of hard-won experience, the natural evolution of a judge who had seen too many exaggerated claims to extend automatic sympathy toward anyone wearing a particular kind of history. He rarely stopped to consider that his own unprocessed anxiety about Nathaniel's deployment, and the fear he'd never openly admitted to feeling during those long, silent months of worry, might have quietly reshaped how he viewed every veteran who stood before his bench afterward. His court clerk, a sharp and increasingly frustrated young woman named Elise Duval, had watched this pattern develop with growing alarm over the 18 months she'd worked in his chambers. She had personally logged at least 4 cases involving military claimants that Ashworth had dismissed within minutes, often without opening the submitted case files at all. She had raised the concern once, carefully, during a quiet moment in chambers. "Your Honor, are you certain you don't want a few more minutes to review Mr. Marchetti's documentation before today's hearing?" Ashworth had waved the suggestion aside without looking up from his coffee. "I've read enough sob stories to recognize a pattern, Ms. Duval. This docket doesn't have time for every hard-luck excuse that walks through that door." Elise had said nothing further that morning, though something inside her had quietly, permanently shifted. She had no idea, watching Ashworth prepare for that afternoon's hearing, that within 24 hours his entire pattern of dismissals would be laid bare in front of people with far more power to stop it than she alone possessed. The courtroom that afternoon was fuller than usual. Several veterans' advocacy volunteers seated quietly in the gallery alongside a small handful of reporters, covering a broader story on regional foreclosure disputes. Julian's attorney, a soft-spoken pro bono lawyer named Rebecca Alvarez, had barely finished her opening statement, summarizing the federal protections at stake, when Ashworth interrupted. "Counsel, I'm familiar with the relevant statute," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's move directly to your client's testimony so we can conclude this efficiently." Rebecca exchanged a brief, uneasy glance with Julian before nodding, gesturing for him to approach the podium. Julian stepped forward, folder in hand, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Your Honor, I served 2 tours overseas. I have documentation showing the foreclosure notice was mailed while I was deployed, in direct violation of federal protections for—" "I've heard this story a dozen times this month alone," Ashworth interrupted, still without so much as glancing at the folder sitting closed in front of him. "Every veteran who can't manage their finances suddenly discovers a federal protection clause. Case dismissed." A ripple of stunned murmurs moved through the gallery. "Your Honor," Rebecca said quickly, rising from her seat, "my client has substantial documentation supporting this claim, including deployment orders and mortgage servicer correspondence that clearly demonstrates—" "Counsel, I don't need paperwork to recognize a pattern," Ashworth said sharply. "Your Honor, if you just review the—" Julian tried again. "Get out, soldier!" Ashworth's voice thundered across the courtroom, rising from his chair, his face flushed with sudden anger. "This court has no patience left for manufactured sympathy. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Marchetti out before I hold him in contempt." The bailiff, visibly uncomfortable, stepped forward hesitantly. Julian stood frozen, the folder still clutched tightly in his hands. 42 unread pages representing the only home he and his daughter had left. "Your Honor, please, if you would just—" "This hearing is concluded," Ashworth said flatly, already gathering his own papers, refusing to make further eye contact. Rebecca placed a steady hand on Julian's shoulder, guiding him gently toward the exit, as murmurs of disbelief continued rippling through the gallery behind them. In the back row, Elise Duval sat frozen, her pen still hovering above her notepad, watching the scene unfold with an expression that had shifted from discomfort into something closer to quiet resolve. She had watched this exact injustice happen before. This time, she promised herself, she wasn't going to simply log it and move on. The story spread quickly through Millhaven's small local news cycle by that evening. A shaky cell phone video capturing the judge's outburst circulating rapidly among veterans' advocacy groups online. Julian sat at his kitchen table that night, Rosalie already asleep down the hall, staring at the foreclosure paperwork spread out before him, feeling something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Complete defeat. "I don't understand," Rebecca said over the phone, her voice tight with frustration. "He didn't even glance at the documentation. 11 years on the bench, and he dismissed a case involving federal protections without opening a single page." "What happens now?" Julian asked quietly. "We file an emergency appeal first thing tomorrow morning," Rebecca said. "It's a long shot on this timeline, but given what just happened in that courtroom, I think we have grounds to argue the dismissal itself was procedurally improper." Julian rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. "And if the appeal doesn't move fast enough?" "The foreclosure sale is scheduled for Friday." Rebecca hesitated. "I won't lie to you, Julian. Appeals typically take weeks, sometimes months, to even reach a hearing. Friday is 3 days away." Julian sat in silence for a long moment after the call ended, staring at Rosalie's school photo taped to the refrigerator, wondering how he was supposed to explain to an 11-year-old that the home she'd grown up in might not exist by the end of the week. The next morning, Rosalie found him still sitting at the kitchen table, the same paperwork spread out in front of him, dark circles forming beneath his eyes. "Dad, did you sleep at all?" she asked, setting her backpack down slowly. "A little," Julian admitted, forcing a smile he didn't quite feel. "Don't worry about me. Eat your breakfast before the bus comes." Rosalie hesitated, studying him with the particular seriousness only children seem capable of when they sense something is genuinely wrong. "Some kids at school saw the video. The one where the judge yelled at you." Julian's stomach tightened. "I'm sorry you had to see that." "I wasn't embarrassed," Rosalie said firmly. "I was mad. You didn't do anything wrong. He just didn't want to listen." Julian reached across the table, squeezing her hand gently. "Sometimes people in positions of power forget that listening is part of the job. But that doesn't mean we stop trying to be heard." Rosalie nodded, though the worry in her eyes didn't fully disappear as she gathered her backpack and headed toward the door, leaving Julian alone once more with paperwork that suddenly felt heavier than it had the night before. Meanwhile, across town, Elise Duval sat at her own kitchen table, laptop open, quietly compiling something she'd been building for months without fully admitting it to herself. A spreadsheet documenting every veteran-related case Judge Ashworth had dismissed over the past 18 months, cross-referenced against how many minutes he'd spent reviewing each file before ruling. The pattern, once she finally organized it clearly, was undeniable. 14 cases, an average review time of under 90 seconds each. 12 of those 14 dismissals had later been quietly reversed or settled once claimants secured outside legal representation and appealed through separate channels. She stared at the spreadsheet for a long time, fully aware that sharing it could cost her a job she genuinely needed. But she thought of Julian Marchetti standing at that podium, folder trembling in his hands, and found she couldn't quite bring herself to close the laptop and pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. She had no idea yet exactly who she needed to send it to, but she knew, with growing certainty, that someone above Ashworth needed to see it before Friday's foreclosure sale made the entire question permanently irrelevant. Midpoint twist. The following morning, Elise arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, still turning over the previous night's spreadsheet in her mind, when she overheard a conversation in the hallway that stopped her cold. Two senior court administrators were discussing an upcoming appellate rotation, mentioning offhand that the Regional Court of Appeals judge scheduled to review emergency filings that week was a woman named Judge Patricia Renner, a former JAG Corps attorney who had served in the military herself before transitioning into civilian judicial service. Elise's mind raced. If Rebecca Alvarez's emergency appeal could reach Judge Renner's docket specifically, rather than being distributed randomly among the appellate rotation, there was at least a chance the case would receive the kind of careful scrutiny Ashworth had refused to provide. She also recalled something else, a name she'd seen mentioned in an old service record buried inside the Veterans Court liaison files she managed as part of her clerking duties. A name that, until this exact moment, she hadn't fully connected to anything relevant. Judge Ashworth's own son, Captain Nathaniel Ashworth, had served overseas years earlier, in a unit that had experienced a documented combat incident resulting in a Silver Star recommendation for an unnamed soldier who had carried him to safety under heavy fire, after an ambush left him critically wounded. Nathaniel had spoken about that day only rarely, and always with a strange, aching gratitude toward a rescuer whose name he'd never learned, identified in official reports only by a radio call sign, Wolf 6. Elise didn't yet know whether the connection meant anything at all. But something about the timeline, the unit designation, and the geographic deployment records nagged at her insistently enough that she couldn't quite let it go. She pulled up Julian Marchetti's original VA case file, the one Rebecca Alvarez had submitted as supporting documentation, and began scanning through his deployment history and unit assignments with far more urgency than she'd ever applied to routine clerical work before. What she found on page 31 of that file made her sit back in her chair, stunned into complete silence. By Thursday afternoon, Rebecca Alvarez's emergency appeal had been filed, though without any guarantee it would reach a judge in time to halt Friday's scheduled foreclosure sale. Julian spent that day at home, unable to focus on work, watching Rosalie do her homework at the same kitchen table, where he'd once dreamed of teaching her to ride a bike in the backyard. They were now days away from losing. "Dad," Rosalie asked quietly, looking up from her math worksheet, "are we really going to have to move?" Julian forced a reassuring smile he didn't entirely feel. "We're doing everything we can, sweetheart. I promise you that." That evening, Rebecca called with an update that felt, at first, like a small miracle. The appeal has been assigned to Judge Patricia Renner's docket. She's agreed to an emergency hearing tomorrow morning before the scheduled foreclosure sale. Julian felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in days. "That's incredible news." "It is," Rebecca agreed carefully. "But I need to warn you, emergency appellate reversals of this kind are rare. Judge Renner will need compelling grounds to overturn Ashworth's ruling on this timeline, and right now, all we have is the procedural argument that he dismissed the case without properly reviewing the evidence. Is that not enough?" "It might be," Rebecca said. "But appellate judges are often reluctant to directly criticize a colleague's conduct without overwhelming justification. We need something stronger than he didn't read the file. We need something that makes the injustice undeniable." Julian hung up the phone that night, uncertain whether tomorrow's hearing would bring the relief he desperately needed, or simply another polite dismissal dressed in more careful legal language. He had no idea that across town, Elise Duval had spent the entire evening cross-referencing military records late into the night, piecing together a connection so specific, so improbable, that she'd nearly convinced herself she must be wrong, before finally confirming it beyond any reasonable doubt. She had also, against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed, made a decision that would likely end her career at the courthouse regardless of tomorrow's outcome. She had sent everything she'd found directly to Judge Patricia Renner's chambers, along with a short, carefully worded note explaining exactly why she believed the connection mattered. That night, unable to sleep, Julian sat on his back porch, staring out at the small yard where Rosalie had learned to catch fireflies the summer before he deployed. He thought about the ambush outside Kandahar, the one that had earned him his Purple Heart, though he rarely spoke of the details even with people who asked directly. He thought about the young soldier he'd pulled from a burning vehicle that day, a captain from another platoon whose name he'd never bothered to learn, focused only on getting him to safety before the second wave of gunfire arrived. He'd carried that soldier nearly 400 yards under fire, refusing to leave him behind despite his own injuries, refusing to stop moving even after shrapnel tore through his forearm. He remembered the young captain's face, pale with blood loss, murmuring a confused thank you before losing consciousness entirely. Julian had never learned what happened to him afterward. He'd been reassigned within weeks, and in the chaos of deployment, Names and faces from a single terrible afternoon often disappeared into a blur of subsequent missions. He'd received a commendation recommendation for the incident, though the paperwork had been filed under his radio call sign rather than his given name, a common enough clerical quirk during that particular rotation. He'd nearly forgotten the specific details entirely, until Rosalie, home from school one afternoon years later, had asked him directly why he'd earned his Purple Heart, and he'd found himself telling her, haltingly, about the young captain he'd carried to safety, wondering aloud whether the man had ever fully recovered. "Do you ever think about finding him?" Rosalie had asked. "Just to see if he's okay?" "Sometimes," Julian admitted, "but I figure if he wanted to find me, he would have by now. Some things are better left as memories." Sitting on his porch that night, 3 days from losing the home he'd built for his daughter, Julian had no idea that the very same captain he'd once carried to safety was, at that exact moment, the son of the judge who'd just publicly humiliated him in open court. Judge Patricia Renner arrived at her chambers before dawn Friday morning, Elise Duval's late-night email already open on her screen. The connection laid out in careful, methodical detail. She had cross-referenced Elise's findings against her own knowledge of military service records, confirming what the young clerk had painstakingly assembled. Julian Marchetti's deployment records placed him in the exact unit, at the exact location, on the exact date of a documented ambush that had nearly killed a young captain named Nathaniel Ashworth. The after-action report, declassified years earlier and available through standard veterans' record requests, described an unnamed soldier, identified only by the radio call sign Wolf 6, carrying the wounded captain nearly 400 yards under sustained enemy fire. An act that had earned a Silver Star recommendation, ultimately lost in a records transfer during a subsequent troop rotation. Julian Marchetti's own service record confirmed his call sign during that specific deployment window, Wolf 6. Renner sat back in her chair, absorbing the full weight of what she'd just confirmed. The man Judge Desmond Ashworth had publicly humiliated, dismissed without reading a single page of his case file, was the very soldier who had saved his own son's life on a battlefield years earlier, a fact neither man had any reason to know. Buried beneath mismatched names, radio call signs, and the simple chaos of military record-keeping. She picked up her phone and called Rebecca Alvarez directly. "I've reviewed your emergency appeal," Renner said. "I want you and Mr. Marchetti in my courtroom in 2 hours." "2 hours?" Rebecca said, startled. "Your Honor, I appreciate the urgency, but I want to make sure we're fully prepared to—" "Ms. Alvarez," Renner interrupted gently, "I don't think you fully understand what I've just uncovered. I'd strongly suggest you bring Mr. Marchetti's full service record, including any documentation related to a Silver Star recommendation from his second deployment. I have a strong suspicion it's about to become directly relevant to this appeal." Rebecca, confused but sensing the seriousness in Renner's voice, agreed immediately, rushing to contact Julian before the foreclosure sale, scheduled for that same afternoon, could proceed any further. Meanwhile, Judge Ashworth arrived at his own chambers that morning, entirely unaware that anything unusual was unfolding, preparing for what he assumed would be an ordinary day on the bench, still convinced his dismissal of Julian Marchetti's case the previous day had been entirely justified. He had no idea that within hours his own son would be sitting in a courtroom gallery, about to learn the true identity of the soldier his father had ordered removed from a courtroom under threat of contempt. The emergency appellate hearing convened at 11 o'clock that morning. Judge Renner presiding, Julian and Rebecca seated at the petitioner's table, a small gathering of reporters and veterans advocates filling the gallery behind them. Judge Ashworth, summoned unexpectedly to provide context on his original ruling, sat stiffly near the front, visibly irritated at having his morning docket interrupted for what he assumed was a routine procedural review. Your Honor, Rebecca began, addressing Judge Renner, we respectfully request reversal of the lower court's dismissal. Based on clear evidence that Mr. Marchetti's federal protections were violated and that the original hearing failed to properly consider the documentation presented. Judge Renner nodded slowly. I've reviewed the case file extensively, Ms. Alvarez. I agree the original dismissal was procedurally improper. But before I issue my ruling, I'd like to address something else entirely. She turned toward the gallery where, at her specific request, a man in his early 30s sat quietly near the back. Captain Nathaniel Ashworth, summoned that morning under the vague explanation that his testimony might be relevant to an unrelated Veterans Affairs matter. Captain Ashworth, Renner said, would you mind approaching the front of the courtroom? Nathaniel rose, visibly confused, making his way toward the front as Judge Ashworth watched his son with obvious bewilderment. Captain, I understand you received a Silver Star recommendation following an incident overseas in which an unnamed soldier saved your life during an ambush, Renner said. That's correct, Your Honor, Nathaniel said slowly. I never learned his actual name. I only knew him by his radio call sign. Wolf 6. Renner turned toward Julian. Mr. Marchetti, would you mind confirming your radio call sign during your second deployment? Julian, still confused about where this line of questioning was headed, answered carefully. Wolf 6, Your Honor. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Nathaniel Ashworth turned slowly, staring at Julian for a long, breathless moment before his composure finally cracked entirely. You're the one who carried me. I've spent years wondering who you were. Judge Ashworth, seated near the front, rose slowly from his chair, his face draining of color as the full weight of the revelation settled over him. This is the same man, he said quietly, almost to himself. The same man you ordered removed from your courtroom under threat of contempt, Renner said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. Without reading a single page of his case file. The entire gallery sat in stunned silence, the full shape of the injustice and the impossible coincidence beneath it, finally laid bare in front of everyone present. I want to be absolutely clear about what's happening here, Judge Renner said, addressing the courtroom, her voice steady and unwavering. This appeal is granted, effective immediately. Mr. Marchetti's foreclosure proceeding is vacated in its entirety, and this court finds that the original dismissal failed to meet even the most basic standard of judicial review. Applause rippled quietly through the gallery before Renner raised a hand for silence. But this case represents something larger than one man's foreclosure dispute, she continued. I've reviewed documentation showing at least 14 veteran-related cases dismissed by Judge Ashworth over the past 18 months, with an average review time of under 90 seconds per case. That pattern, combined with today's revelations, warrants a formal judicial conduct review, which I will be personally requesting through the appropriate oversight channels. Judge Ashworth stood frozen near the front of the courtroom, his son beside him, both men processing the full weight of what had just unfolded. Dad, Nathaniel said quietly, his voice trembling with a mixture of emotions Julian couldn't fully read. You humiliated the man who saved my life. You didn't even give him the courtesy of reading his case file. I didn't know, Ashworth said, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no way of knowing. That's exactly the problem, Nathaniel said, his composure finally breaking. You didn't need to know who he was to treat him with basic respect. You needed to actually do your job. Judge Ashworth, unable to meet his son's eyes, turned instead toward Julian, standing quietly a few feet away. Mr. Marchetti, I owe you an apology I don't know how to properly give. Julian considered his words carefully before responding. You owe more than an apology, Your Honor. You owe every veteran whose case you dismissed without reading it the same chance you're finally giving mine. In the weeks that followed, the Judicial Conduct Review Renner initiated confirmed the full extent of Ashworth's pattern, resulting in a formal reprimand, mandatory retraining, and a public commitment to review each of the 14 previously dismissed cases with proper scrutiny. 3 of those cases, upon review, resulted in outcomes reversed entirely in the veteran's favor. Elise Duval, whose research had ultimately uncovered the connection at the heart of the entire case, received a formal commendation from the county's Judicial Oversight Committee, along with an offer to continue her legal career under Judge Renner's direct mentorship, an offer she accepted without hesitation. Rebecca Alvarez's small veterans legal aid clinic saw a surge of new volunteers and donations in the weeks following the story's public attention, allowing her to expand services to dozens of additional veterans facing similar bureaucratic injustices. And Julian Marchetti, standing outside the courthouse that afternoon with Rosalie finally beside him, felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in nearly 2 years. The quiet, solid certainty that the home they'd built together was finally, truly safe. 3 weeks later, Julian stood in his own backyard on Kestrel Lane, watching Rosalie ride her bike in slow, wobbling circles across the grass, exactly the way he'd once imagined teaching her before the entire ordeal began. Nathaniel Ashworth visited that weekend, standing awkwardly near the porch steps, still clearly uncertain how to properly express years of accumulated gratitude. "I looked for you for a long time," Nathaniel admitted. "After I recovered, I tried tracking down every soldier who matched the description in the after-action report. I never imagined I'd find you like this." "I never expected to be found at all," Julian said honestly. "I figured whatever I did that day was just part of the job." "It wasn't just part of the job," Nathaniel said firmly. "You saved my life. And somehow, all these years later, my own father nearly destroyed yours without ever realizing the connection." Julian considered this for a long moment. "Your father apologized. That matters more than you might think. He's requested a formal meeting with your legal aid clinic," Nathaniel said. "He wants to personally review each case he dismissed without proper consideration. I think this whole thing shook something loose in him that's been stuck for a long time." Judge Ashworth, in the weeks following the judicial review, had indeed begun a quiet, deliberate process of reform, reviewing each of his 14 prior dismissals personally, issuing formal apologies where warranted, and implementing a new internal policy requiring documented review time for every case that crossed his docket. Elise Duval, settling comfortably into her new mentorship under Judge Renner, often stopped by the Veterans Legal Aid Clinic on weekends, helping Rebecca Alvarez manage the surge of new cases with the same careful attention to detail that had once uncovered Julian's connection to Nathaniel in the first place. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing all of this?" Rosalie asked her father one evening, gesturing toward their small backyard, their modest home, the life they'd built together against considerable odds. Julian considered the question carefully, thinking about 90-second dismissals, buried radio call signs, and a young clerk's quiet refusal to look away from an injustice she could have easily ignored. "Every single day," he admitted, "which is exactly why I never plan to take any of it for granted again." "So tell me, where are you watching this from? Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. I truly do read as many as I can, and I'd love to know, what was your favorite moment in this story? Was it the reveal in the courtroom, or that quiet final scene in the backyard? Would you have recognized the connection the way Elise did, or would this story have stayed buried forever? If this story moved you, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes the truth always finds its way to the surface. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.